Emma Caldwell wasn't just any housewife, she was the envy of her neighbors. With a picture-perfect life that hid her darkest desires behind the manicured lawns and white picket fences of suburbia. Emma's craving for the forbidden was growing uncontrollable. What began as whispered fantasies with her husband Mark spiraled into something far more dangerous when she revealed an obsession that shocked him glory holes. But this wasn't just a fantasy. For Emma, it was a hunger, a secret that would tear apart their marriage and unravel into a deadly betrayal neither saw coming. At first, he laughed it off, assuming it was a joke, but Emma's eyes, burning with intensity, told him she was dead serious. The thought unsettled him, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the intrigue. He loved Emma, her beauty, her charm. And if this was something that made her happy, maybe they could explore it together. Reluctantly, Mark agreed to visit one of the sea spots Emma had mentioned. A secretive place she had discovered online, what started as an uncomfortable curiosity soon turned into something darker, more consuming. The anonymity, the thrill of watching his wife with strangers, Mark found himself pulled deeper into Emma's world of sexual obsession. But as the nights grew wilder and the line between fantasy and reality blurred, Mark would soon discover that Emma's obsession wasn't something she could control. Neither, for that matter, could he. The first time they went, Mark could barely breathe. The atmosphere was heavy with an almost animalistic tension. Hidden in the shadows of an anonymous back room, Emma, dressed in nothing but her most provocative lingerie, approached thee with a confident smile. Mark watched from the side, his heart pounding, a mix of jealousy and arousal coursing through him. He wasn't prepared for what would happen next. As Emma engaged with whoever was on the other side, Mark's emotions shifted. What initially disgusted him now excited him beyond measure. He never imagined watching her could feel this intense. It wasn't long before Emma took it further. She began exploring her bisexuality in ways Mark had never seen before. She was the star, the object of everyone's attention, and he couldn't deny the allure. Soon it became their weekend escape. They visited several times, meeting a rotation of strangers sinking deeper into their secret world. Mark thought he was in control, but what he failed to notice was how Emma's obsession was growing. Each visit left her craving more, wanting more than Mark could give her. She was slipping away from him, and he didn't even realize it. Yet it wasn't long before the tension crept into their home life. Mark had always been the dominant one in their marriage, but now, Emma's newfound confidence at the glory holes had her taking control in ways that left him feeling vulnerable. At first, Mark enjoyed seeing his wife empowered, but as her obsession grew, it became harder to ignore the warning signs. Emma was different now. She wanted more. More of the thrill, more of the strangers, more of the dominance she experienced in those anonymous rooms. What started as a shared adventure was quickly becoming her own private addiction. She began asking to go more frequently, pushing their boundaries, testing his limits. Mark started Ed to resent the very thing that had once excited him. When he told her they should stop, Emma's response was cold, almost calculating. She wanted it, needed it, and it was clear nothing he said would change her mind. For the first time, Mark saw a side of Emma that terrified him, a woman willing to risk everything for her insatiable desires. Unable to shake his growing unease, Mark finally put his foot down. No more, he said firmly. The glory holes had taken over their lives, and he couldn't bear it any longer. Emma's obsession was destroying their marriage, and if she didn't stop, he feared it would consume her entirely. At first she seemed to agree, but Mark sensed the tension beneath her calm exterior. He thought they had reached an understanding. He was wrong. Emma wasn't finished. Behind Mark's back, she continued visiting the secret places, sinking deeper into her addiction. She craved the control, the power, the attention she received from strangers. Mark was no longer enough for her, and as she spiraled into a world of daily affairs, she had no idea she was walking straight into the jaws of betrayal and death. Mark began to notice the small things, late nights' hidden messages, lies that unraveled at the slightest tug. Emma was playing a dangerous game, And when Mark finally discovered the truth, his world shattered. Fueled by jealousy and rage, he started a plan he would make. Sure, Emma never stepped foot in one of those places again. But his revenge wouldn't stop there. Emma's deception was flawless. Each day after Mark left for work, she slipped into a world that belonged to her alone. She had become a master at hiding her tracks, deleting messages masking her whereabouts, and offering explanations that seemed innocent enough. But behind that carefully crafted exterior, her addiction was spiraling out of control. The glory holes became her sanctuary. Each encounter fed her growing hunger for dominance and submission, male and female, bodies she could lose herself in without ever knowing their names. She wasn't just exploring her sexuality anymore. She was indulging in a deep, uncontrollable obsession, her days blurred into a series of secret trysts, tangled in the lustful heat of bodies that weren't her husband's. And while Mark toiled away at his 9 to 5, unaware of the extent of her betrayal, Emma thrived in the dark corners of this hidden life. One day, as she stood on the other side of that infamous hole, her pulse racing in anticipation, she realized something. The danger thrilled her. The secrecy, the risk of getting caught only intensified her desire. She had gone too far to turn back now. Little did she know. Mark was already one step ahead, his mind festering with suspicion. It started with subtle clues, things Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. Emma's sudden changes in routine, the hollow excuses, the distant look in her eyes that told him she was somewhere else, even when she was lying in bed next to him. At first he dismissed it as paranoia, a product of his own guilt for indulging in such a twisted world with her. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. One afternoon, Mark came home early from work. Emma wasn't there. Her phone, usually glued to her hand, was nowhere to be found. Something wasn't right. He waited, heart pounding in his chest, until she walked through the door. Hours later, flushed and breathless, the lies flowed so easily from her lips, but her scent betrayed her. An intoxicating mix of perfume and sweat that wasn't his own. That was the moment everything changed. Mark was no longer in denial. His wife had crossed a line, and his jealousy boiled over into something far more dangerous. He began following her, his mind unraveling as he pieced together the truth. She was going to the glory holes without him having sex with strangers, men and women behind his back. The jealousy gnawed at him, sinking its teeth deeper with each passing day. He couldn't stop thinking about the others, who they were, what they were doing to his wife, and how she reveled in it. His fantasies turned dark, morphed by rage and humiliation. If Emma was going to betray him like this, she had to pay. Mark's mind descended into a terrifying place, one where love and obsession twisted into something unrecognizable. He could barely sleep, haunted by images of Emma with faceless men, strangers who took what was his. The jealousy became unbearable, festering into rage. He couldn't control her anymore. He could feel her slipping through his fingers, and there was only one solution left. He had to end it. One night, lying next to her in bed, he began to formulate the plan. Emma was always so careless, so confident that she could hide her secret life from him. He would use that to his advantage. His thoughts turned to her life insurance policy. She was worth more to him dead than alive. Now the idea thrilled him, gave him a sick sense of power he hadn't felt in months. He'd make it look like someone else did. Emma had so many lovers, it wouldn't be hard to pin the blame on one of them. Mark began to gather information, obsessively tracking Emma's every move, cataloging the people she met, the places she went. He knew where she went during the day, who she was with, and exactly when she would be most vulnerable, and when the time came, he would strike, leaving no trace that could lead back to him. Emma had no idea how closely she was being watched. She moved through her secret life with reckless abandon, emboldened by the thrill of her deception. The more dangerous it became, the more she craved it. Glory holes during the day, affairs with strangers. By night, Emma was drowning in her lust, blind to the storm brewing at home. Zrenya Mark, on the other hand, was a man consumed by his plan. Each day he grew colder, more calculating, his emotions buried beneath a mask of calm indifference. He began to lay the groundwork, planting seeds of doubt among the small group of people Emma regularly engaged. with he whispered lies, crafted stories, and ensured that when the time came, all eyes would fall on someone else. The day he decided to act, the tension between them had reached its peak. Emma could sense the shift in him, but chalked it up to frustration over her long absences. She had no idea her husband was already plotting her murder as she left the house thinking he was none the wiser. Mark was already following her, slipping into the shadows ready to strike. The glory hole that had once been their shared secret would now become the stage for Emma's ultimate betrayal and Mark's perfect crime. Emma's usual spot was in a forgotten corner of the city, buried beneath the fluorescent hum of a desolate strip club. It was there in that dingy, dimly lit room that she shed her role as the perfect suburban wife and indulged in her deepest, darkest desires. Today was no different, except for the pair of eyes that followed her every move. Mark trailed her from a distance, his pulse steady, his mind calm. The plan had been set in motion, and now there was no turning back. He watched as she slipped inside, completely unaware of his presence. It disgusted him how easily she did this, how effortlessly she moved from their home to this world of strangers and secret lovers. He hated her, loved her, wanted to destroy her and possess her all at once. His heart pounded in his chest as he imagined her on the other side of the glory hole, her body in the hands of yet another faceless man. Mark clenched his fists, knowing that tonight it would be the last time. As Emma disappeared into the shadows of the room, Mark checked his watch. Component placement. The others would be arriving soon. He had planned it all so carefully, tracking her routine, knowing exactly when her regular partners would show up. All it took was a few anonymous messages to set the trap. Tonight, the glory hole would not be a place of pleasure, but a scene of chaos and bloodshed. Inside the dark room, Emma's pulse quickened with anticipation. She had become a regular here, and the anonymous encounters now felt like an addiction she couldn't break. The thrill of being watched, of submitting to someone else's desires, had taken over her life. She didn't care about the danger anymore. She craved it. What she couldn't see was the danger creeping ever closer. Watching her every move from just beyond the door as she prepared for the encounter, she noticed something different. The usual routine fell off. The silence in the room was heavier than usual, an oppressive weight that made her uneasy. Still, she dismissed it, chalking it up to her own nerves. But the man who approached her from the other side of the hole wasn't one of her regulars. There was something rougher, more aggressive in his touch, a violent simmering just beneath the surface. Outside, Mark waited. His hands were steady, his mind clear. He had chosen tonight carefully. An off night, when there would be fewer witnesses, when the door finally opened and the others entered. Mark's heart pounded with dark satisfaction. He had orchestrated everything perfectly. The strangers she had been meeting with would have no idea what was coming next. The first attack came swift and brutal. One of the men, blinded by the darkness of the room, never saw it coming. Mark had waited until the moment was right, a knife concealed in the sleeve of his jacket, as Emma moaned on the other side of the partition, completely lost in her act. Mark stabbed the man without hesitation. The wet sound of the blade cutting through flesh was muted by the heavy thrum of music outside the room. The man's body crumpled to the ground with a soft thud, and no one was the wiser. Emma was too engrossed in her own world, too caught up in the ecstasy of her desires to notice anything had gone wrong. Mark's heart raced, but not from fear, from excitement. He had planned this to perfection, and now the dominoes were falling exactly as he had predicted. He moved quickly, his movements precise, calculated. The second man, the one Emma had been intimately involved with for months, was next. Mark cornered him before he could even process what was happening. The knife found its target again, a swift, decisive strike to the chest. This time, the man let out a groan of pain before collapsing to the floor. The life draining from his eyes as Mark stood over him, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. When Emma finally realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The usual anonymity of the room had been replaced by a strange, unsettling quiet. Her pulse quickened, not from arousal this time, but from a growing sense of dread. She slowly backed away from the partition, pulling her clothes back on in hurried, trembling motions. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the door, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as she stepped into the dim hallway, her stomach twisted with a terrible feeling. That's when she saw him, Mark, standing there, his face calm, but his eyes burning with a fury she had never seen before. His clothes were splattered with blood, and in his hand, the knife gleamed under the dull fluorescent light. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what have you done?" He stepped toward her slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, Emma saw the man she had married, the man who had once loved her so deeply. But now he was something else entirely, something terrifying, something broken. "You couldn't stop, could you?" he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I gave you everything, Emma. I let you have your fun, but you had to betray me." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the full weight of her betrayal crashing down on her. She had pushed him too far, gone too deep into a world she could no longer escape. And now standing before her was the consequence of her actions. Her husband transformed into a killer. Emma stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold, stained wall of the hallway. Mark's footsteps echoed in the narrow space, slow and deliberate, each one sending a shock of fear through her body. He didn't rush. There was no need. She was trapped, and he knew it. The glint of the blood-streaked knife in his hand seemed to grow brighter as he closed the distance between them. "Mark, please." Emma's voice trembled, her breath catching in her throat. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I'm sorry." The words spilled out of her, desperate and hollow. But there was no fixing this, and she knew it. The look in his eyes was pure, unfiltered rage, a mixture of betrayal and possession that had consumed him entirely. Mark tilted his head slightly as if considering her apology, his lips curling into a chilling half-smile. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're sorry now, after everything." He took another step forward, his body blocking the dim light from the flickering bulb above. "You lied to me, over and over again. And for what? For them?" He jerked his head toward the room where the bodies lay, twisted and lifeless. Emma's knees buckled beneath her, and she slid down the wall, her chest heaving as panic clawed her, the sight of the blood on him, the knife in his hand. This was no longer the man she had married. This was something darker, something she had helped create. In her desperation for excitement, for power, she had unleashed a monster. "Mark, I love you," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please let me go." But Mark only shook his head, his smile vanishing. "It's too late for that." Mark lunged, and Emma scrambled backward, her body shaking as she tried to distance herself from him. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe, her survival instincts kicking in, but her legs felt like jelly beneath her. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her up violently. She gasped, her back slamming against the wall, and the pain brought her back to the moment. She had to get away. "I loved you, Emma," Mark growled through clenched teeth, his face inches from hers. "But you couldn't stop yourself. You chose them over me. You chose this filth over us." His grip tight on her arm, and Emma winced in pain, but her mind raced for a way out. His anger had made him reckless. There was still a chance, some way to escape. She had to distract him, disarm him. Her eyes flickered to the knife, gleaming in his hand, and in a flash of desperation, she kicked at his knee with all the strength she could muster. Mark staggered just for a moment, but it was enough. Emma wrenched herself free and bolted down the hallway. Her breath ragged and uneven, her heart thundered in her chest as she ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The exit was just ahead. If she could reach it, she could survive. But Mark recovered quickly. His footsteps pounded behind her faster, angrier. She could hear his breathing, heavy and furious, growing closer. Emma's body screamed for air, but she kept running, her vision narrowing to the neon exit sign at the end of the corridor. She reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the handle, just as Mark's hand caught her hair and yanked her back. Emma cried out, falling to the floor, her body slamming hard into the concrete. The sharp pain shot through her, and she felt the world spin. Mark stood over her, his chest heaving with rage, the knife in his hand dripping with intent. The moment stretched out into eternity. Emma's vision blurred as she stared up at her husband, her body weak, her breath shallow. Mark raised the knife, his hands steady, his eyes dark with the finality of what he was about to do. "This is your fault, Emma," he whispered, almost tenderly, as if the words were meant to comfort her in her final moments. "I wanted us to have something special, but you couldn't stop. You betrayed me." Emma's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything that could save her. But it was too late. She had pushed him too far, driven him to this moment, and now she was powerless to stop it. The knife came down. There was no time to scream. Emma's world exploded into a blur of pain and darkness as the blade pierced her chest. The air rushed from her lungs, her hands weakly grasping at Mark's wrist, but the strength was gone. Blood seeped from the wound, spreading beneath her like a dark crimson pool. Mark knelt beside her, his breath shallow, his eyes wide as he watched the life drain from his wife's body. His hand trembled as he pulled the knife free, but he felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. He had won, and yet he had lost everything. Mark sat in the silence, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had done. Emma lay still now, her eyes wide, staring lifelessly at the ceiling. The room was heavy with the stench of blood and death, and the thrill he had expected, the sense of justice, never came. Only a cold, hollow pit remained. The reality of his actions began to sink in. Gnawing at his insides, he had killed her. The woman he had once loved, who had shared his bed, his life, and for what? To claim back a sense of control, to punish her for her desires. As the minutes ticked by, Mark stood slowly, staring down at his bloodied hands. The plan wasn't over yet. He had more to do. Emma, death alone wasn't enough. He needed the insurance money, and he needed someone to take the fall. Carefully, he began wiping the knife-clean planting evidence, component placement setting the stage for the next phase of his plan. Someone else would take the blame. Someone who had been part of Emma's world of secrets and shadows. Mark had already prepared for this moment, and soon. The police would have all the evidence they needed to arrest the wrong man. He glanced down at Emma. One last time, her body cruel reminder of the woman she had been. With one final look, Mark turned and walked away, leaving behind the ruins of their twisted love. Mark moved through the aftermath with a chilling precision. His emotions, anger, jealousy, regret, were buried deep beneath the surface now. This was no longer about his rage. It was about survival. Everything had to go perfectly. Emma's death needed to look like something else. And Mark had already chosen in his scapegoat a man from her secret life, someone she had been seeing regularly at the glory holes. He wiped down the knife, careful not to leave a trace, and placed it in the hand of his chosen target. The man whose body he had left crumpled in the corner of the dark room. The story was simple: a lover's quarrel, an argument that had spiraled out of control. Emma's blood on the man's clothes, his fingerprints on the weapon, it all pointed to him. Mark took out a burner phone he had bought weeks ago. He sent a series of text messages from Emma's phone to the man's, fabricating a confrontation. "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot." It was enough to suggest Emma had walked into her own demise. The text, the knife, the bodies, everything pointed to a jealous lover, and when the police came, they would find only one person to blame. As he stood in the dim light of the room, the stench of blood heavy in the air, Mark felt a sick sense of triumph. It was all falling into place. Soon he would be rid of Emma, rid of her lovers, and he would walk away with her life insurance money. He took one last look at the scene, ensuring everything was in place. Then, slipping into the shadows like a ghost, he left without a trace. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. The manager of the strip club had called in a noise complaint, and when the officers pushed open the door to the room, they found the gruesome scene waiting for them. Emma's body, the two men, the knife. It all fit too neatly. The detectives immediately honed in on the narrative Mark had crafted so meticulously. The investigation was swift, the evidence damning. Blood from Emma and the second victim was found on the man who had been left barely alive at the scene. His fingerprints were on the weapon. The texts exchanged with Emma's phone painted a picture of a meeting that had gone horribly wrong. Within hours, the police had their suspect, a man with a history of violent behavior and a string of casual, anonymous sexual encounters. He was arrested, cuffed, and charged with multiple counts of murder. The media wasted no time sensationalizing the story, splashing headlines of a sordid affair gone deadly across every platform. Mark watched from the sidelines, his face a mask of cold detachment. He attended the police briefings, feigned grief, and gave statements about his wife's troubled behavior, and how he had tried to save her from the dangerous path she had been on. The public ate it up, swallowing the tale of a faithful husband, losing his wife to a world of depravity. No one suspected him. No one could see the darkness lurking behind his grieving facade. For weeks, Mark basked in the success of his plan. He had the sympathy of the media, the insurance money was starting to flow in, and the man he had framed was facing a lifetime behind bars. But as the dust began to settle, something changed. The weight of what he had done started pressing down on him, a constant, suffocating presence he couldn't shake. Every night, he dreamed of Emma. Her eyes, wide with terror as he drove the knife into her chest, haunted his every thought. The blood, the smell, the sound of her final breath. It all replayed in his mind over and over. He had expected to feel relief, a sense of victory, but instead there was only emptiness. And then the cracks in his perfect plan began to show. One of the detectives, an older man with a keen eye for details, began to question the neatness of the case. There were things that didn't quite add up. Why had the suspect, who had been unconscious when the police arrived, failed to flee the scene? Why were there inconsistencies in the timeline? Why did the husband, who claimed to know nothing of his wife's secret life, seem too composed, too prepared for the tragedy? Зрение Марк не заметил вначале, но тихое расследование детектива начало приближаться к нему, небольшие нестыковки в его алиби. Странные transactions with the burner phone and an odd lack of emotion for a man who had just lost his wife in such a brutal way. It was only a matter of time before the police turned their attention to him. The day Mark was arrested, the air was thick with tension. The detective had played his hand well, building the case slowly, quietly until it was undeniable. The evidence they uncovered was damning. Phone records that tied Mark to the scene, traces of blood on his clothes that had gone unnoticed in the initial investigation. And most crucially, the financial motive, Emma's life insurance payout, had been deposited into his account just days before her murder. Mark sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table, staring at the detective across from him. He had lost. He could feel the walls cling in around him, the weight of his sins bearing down like 1,000 tons. He had thought he could outsmart them, that his plan was foolproof, but in the end, his greed, his obsession, had been his downfall as the detective laid out the final pieces of the puzzle. Mark's expression didn't change. Inside, he was screaming, but on the surface, there was only calm. He knew what was coming. He had killed Emma to free himself, but instead, he had shackled himself to a fate far worse. The trial was swift, the jury finding him guilty of multiple murders, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. The media had a field day. Husband's plot for glory hole revenge ends in bloodshed. The death penalty was inevitable. As he sat in his prison cell, waiting for the day of his execution, Mark thought of Emma. In the end, it wasn't just her he had destroyed. It was himself. He had won nothing. All that remained was the darkness he had created, and it would follow him to his grave.